I think we're starting. So I think this morning we're starting in Matthew 17. Am I correct? Is that what everybody else sees,
Yes,
remembers?
that's what I have.
Okay. All right then. Let's start by having somebody read Matthew 17. And I think what we're going to do, probably the best thing, is to take it through to start with verse 13, because that sets off the first section. I'm gonna teach you a new word today, for most of you, for a new word, and that is the word pericope. It's Pericope. And what a pericope is it's a discrete segment of the Bible. It comes from a Greek word that literally means to cut around. And what it is a section of the Bible that can stand on its own. It has a distinct, coherent unit of thought. So what we're going to do is look first at the first pericope here, and that would be, like I say, Matthew 1 through 12. Who would like to volunteer to read that for us?
I'll read it.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. What translation are you going to be reading from?
I'm reading the New American Bible.
Okay.
Okay. Chapter 17, the Transfiguration of Jesus. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John, his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, conversing with him. Then Peter said to Jesus in reply, Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. While he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud cast a shadow over them. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell prostrate and were very much afraid. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, Rise and do not be afraid. And when the disciples raised their eyes, they saw no one else but Jesus alone. As they were coming down from the mountain, Jesus charged them, Do not tell the vision to anyone until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. Then the disciples asked him, Why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? He said in reply, Elijah will indeed come and restore all things. But I tell you that Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but did to him whatever they pleased. So also will the Son of Man suffer at their hands. Then the disciples understood that he was speaking to them of John the Baptist. And that's where mine ends.
Good. Yeah. Thank you, Carol.
Mm-hmm.
Any observations or questions just to start off with about this particular pericope, this particular section? I think it's interesting that Jesus just took 3 disciples with him, Peter and James and John. Seems like they're kind of an inner circle. So he took them with them. His transfiguration is kind of a good example of a kind of a, well, sort of a foreshadowing, but kind of an example, a parable almost, of what was occurring with Jesus. And we see that Jesus was transfigured, and this was something that made quite an impression on the disciples. In fact, they fell flat And I guess if someone was shining light, does this remind any of you of something else that happened in the Old Testament, of someone's glowing so much that people couldn't even really look at him, that they were, does that remind anyone?
When Moses came down from the mountain.
Exactly, exactly. And at this point, Moses presented the law, right? That was the basis of on which the Hebrew people practiced their religion. He brought that. And so we see a transfiguration here. And what we're seeing in the transfiguration is not only Jesus transfigured, but the religion, the gospel is being changed as well. There's going to be a new emphasis here. So here we have Elijah, we have Moses, and we have Jesus. So what does Moses represent? Go ahead, please.
The
The law.
the law, the
Yeah,
law that
exactly. The law. And then we have Elijah. He represents the prophets. Okay. And so this is what the Hebrew religion had been based on, the law and the prophets. That's how they had obeyed the law in all its detail. They had responded to the messages of the prophets. This is what been the center of the Hebrew religion. Now we have Jesus is there. They've got the law and the prophets, and then Jesus is transfigured. He's bright and shining. It doesn't say the others were, but anyway, Jesus is kind of, I wouldn't say supplanting, but he's fulfilling the law and the prophets and taking the Hebrew religion in an entirely different direction. So then we have Peter. Go ahead, please.
Somewhere in the prayers from our prayer book that I hear all the time is the phrase based on all the laws and prophets. And I cannot remember where, but I know I have heard the laws and the prophets in our prayer book, in our services.
Yeah, I'm sure that's the basis of the Hebrew religion, and it still forms a good foundation for the Christian religion. That Jesus came not to abolish or destroy the law and the prophets, but he came to complete them, to fulfill them, to show what the law and prophets were really pointing towards. It wasn't just laws and keeping commandments, but it goes beyond that to what the attitude of the heart is. And we live the law and the prophets out as Jesus did, because it's based on law, love, and grace. That's what the law and the prophets were all about, just to systematize that, to make it simple for people to keep these things, and will point them towards the deeper meaning, which Jesus showed us so clearly, which was love and grace. Love towards God foremost, heart, soul, mind, and strength, and then love to our neighbors, love, as much as we love ourselves. Right. So here we have these three and then we've got Peter stepping up, and Peter's like every man, he's the best of us, he's the worst of us, he's kind of like a lot of us are. So he says whatever is on his mind, and sometimes if he's overwhelmed, he says something just to be saying something. And that's kind of what happened here, I think. And Peter said, well, let's build three tabernacles here, 3 tents here to celebrate. Kind of thinking about on the Feast of Booths, Feast of the Tabernacles. And when he says that, all of a sudden we see this voice coming out of a cloud and saying, this is my son, the beloved, with him I am well pleased. Listen to him. And this is God. I think this is, in a sense, God's nice way of telling Peter, put a sock in it. You really don't know what you're talking about. So they all fell down, and then when they looked up, Jesus was there by himself. So then it talks a little bit about Jesus saying not to tell what happened, and then they talk about Elijah and how Elijah that was prophesied was actually John the Baptist. But this really is a transformative example of the fact that when Jesus came, it wasn't all about the law and the prophets. It wasn't about the written word. It wasn't about just trying to meticulously keep a set of rules, but to go beyond that. There's no set of rules that could be complete enough to be what the gospel was trying to tell us to do, which is to love God and love our neighbors as ourselves. You can't make rules specific enough for that. It gets you in the wrong mentality, the same mentality that the scribes and the Pharisees had. So anything else anybody sees there that
Jesus' purpose for taking them to witness this was just to make them realize who more so who he actually was.
Yeah.
Is that what Jesus' purpose was for them witnessing this meeting with the spirits of Moses and Elijah, was to let them know that he was more than a man?
Yes, that, and also that the direction was changing. I think that it wasn't going to be based just on the law and the prophets, but the gospel he was bringing went beyond that to a gospel of love and grace, and transcended, changed things. Jesus is constantly in contention with the Pharisees, Sadducees, those that want to hold him strictly to the letter of the law. And what he's trying to say, the letter of the law wasn't sufficient. It's not enough. I'm leading you into something more, something greater, something that will actually achieve what the law was trying to begin to teach us. Anything else anybody has to say about this? So why don't we go ahead and go to verse 14? There are two different sections here, but let's just combine them because it's not a long passage. Would someone like to read 14 through the end of the chapter for us then?
We can go ahead and do that.
Okay, Leslie, and you're going to be reading from what?
The NRSV.
Okay.
Okay. When they came to the crowd, a man came to him, knelt before him, and said, "Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is an epileptic and suffers terribly. He even falls into the fire and often into the water. And I brought him to your disciples, but they could not cure him." Jesus answered, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you? How much longer must I put up with you? Bring him here to me." And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the boy was cured instantly. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and says, "Why could we not cast it out?" He said to them, "Because of your little faith. For truly I tell you, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move. And nothing will be impossible for you." As they were gathering in Galilee, Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. And on the third day he will be raised." And they were greatly distressed. When they reached Capernaum, the collectors of the temple tax came to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the temple tax?" He said, "He does." And when he came home, Jesus spoke of it first, asking, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do kings of the earth take toll or tribute? From their children or from others?" When Peter said, "From others," Jesus said to him, "Then the children are free. However, so that we do not give offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook. Take the first fish that comes up, And when you open its mouth, you will find a coin. Take that, give it to them for you and me.
Okay,
Wow.
some interesting things there. Anything anyone notices or would like to say about these two sections?
My book says that the boy is a lunatic. It doesn't say he has epilepsy. It says the father calls him a lunatic, which makes more sense to have a demon come out of him, because epilepsy is usually not caused because of demons. But yeah, my book is that he's possessed by a demon.
What Bible are you reading from, Carol?
This is the New American Bible, which is the Bible that I had for years. It's the Catholic.
Oh, got it. Okay.
The concept of demon possession in the New Testament is one that there's a lot of speculation about, because contemporary people, when they read this and they listen to the symptoms and they observe what they see in the world around them, they often think that many people who were thought to be at that time demon possessed were actually suffering some kind of mental illness.
Yeah.
And that's what lunatic means. Actually, Carol, lunatic refers to Luna, which is the moon, and the belief at that time was that somehow the moon could make people go crazy, like full moons could make people react in strange ways, and that very often what they believed at that time was demon possession might have been some kind of mental illness.
Yeah. Well, I think that thought lasted a long time, because my grandfather, my mother's father, had epilepsy. He had a seizure disorder. And of course, back then they didn't know really what caused it or how to treat it. And, she would tell me stories about how people were afraid of him when he'd have these seizures, and they didn't understand what, they were afraid. So it's not been that long ago that, people started looking at problems that generate out of your brain, whether they be mental or physical, or looked at as being something other than demons in your body.
Without anti-seizure medication, most of us here are old enough to remember people that had epilepsy and had grand mal seizures.
Right.
And if you see a person having a grand mal seizure, it's not hard to understand how you might think that would be demon possession.
Exactly.
I remember when I was in grade school, there was one guy that had grand mal seizures, and I remember walking into the school one time, and I heard upstairs, like was level or two above, and I heard him screaming and he was banging his head on the floor. You could hear that. And so you look at that behavior, and you see that now, of course, we have a lot of anti-seizure medications which control a lot of the seizures, and then it doesn't have the disastrous brain damage that comes as those seizures, right, as well. So yeah, so that is an issue. What are we talking about? But Jesus, I think, whatever he did, he healed him, or however you want to throw out the demons, he was operating, understanding the way people thought at that time. And he wasn't trying to change everything they thought about every issue. He was just trying to show that even though these conditions weren't understood, that he had compassion on those people, and he restored them back to community. And he acted as an example for the people there, that they shouldn't reject those people and make them outcasts, but they need to minister to them and help them in their struggles. Because this poor guy would just, he'd get burned, he'd throw himself in had the rest of drowning, the whole thing. He just was completely out of control. And yet Jesus showed the compassion and restored that person to where he could have a normal life again. So yeah, and it's interesting. Jesus speaks kind of harshly to the disciples here. He says, "You faithless and perverse generation." I think maybe that isn't directed specifically to the disciples, but to the community as a whole. You take a look at the Pharisees, the Sadducees, their strong feelings about the law, and these people were just completely rejected by them. And so he's referring to that as a whole, and that, you know, that the key to the whole situation is having trust, not just trust that you can do it, but trust in him. Trust the fact that God wants to bring healing and restoration. So then Jesus talks about how he's going to be betrayed into human hands, and this is not at all what the disciples were hoping for or thinking he was going to be. They were expecting him to be a Messiah that was going to take over the control of the government and restore the Hebrew people to self-governing and that. And this was pretty disconcerting to them.
So why do you think that the Jews thought that Jesus was going to be their like warrior savior? They've been waiting for this Messiah since supposedly Adam and Eve, and there was no Roman government back then, and this was promised to them. Well, how did that morph into him becoming a warrior savior that was going to save them from Rome? Is it just because of the conditions that they were in that moment, or
they viewed the Messiah basically as a kind of a reincarnation of David and the other kings that fought against the Philistines, and they were looking for someone to take them out of secular bondage, and that's the kind of Messiah they were looking for. So they were looking for a David figure, and when Jesus came, he came not as the kind of Messiah that was going to take the reins of government and by force, you know, bring the Israel nation back into power, but he assumed the kind of messiahship that there are pictures of somewhat in the Old Testament, like in Isaiah, the suffering servant. And he took that form, but it wasn't what most people were expecting. It wasn't what they wanted. They wanted to be back on top. They didn't want the kind of Messiah that Jesus turned out to be, who was willing to die, and a Messiah who ruled by being a servant and helping other people, loving them, not by trying to control them through power and force and the whip, the scourge, the sword, you know. So that they just had a complete misunderstanding at that time about what the Messiah was, or what that was their understanding. And it's still the understanding of Jewish people today of what the Messiah will do, that he's going to come and he's going to be riding on a white horse and he's going to be kicking butt and taking names. And so that's kind of what they're looking for. So
what are they looking for currently for the Messiah to do? This is a different society than
Jews,
hundreds of years ago.
yeah. But I think the Jews are still looking for a political leader to come and put Israel in the forefront and to bring about his kingdom.
Okay.
Kingdom that is basically ruled by Old Testament law, and will put the Hebrew people back into a position of being leaders of the world, the chosen people of God. It's an understanding that the chosen people of the God are necessarily on top. But even if you look at the Old Testament, there are passages that talk about that the chosen people of God were not for their own glory, not for their own power, but these were people who were chosen to be the people of God, to be an example to the nation, to the nations around them, to reach out with compassion and mercy. There are those emphases in the Old Testament, but people being people the way they are, sometimes it's hard to consider that even among Christians, the idea of being servants rather than, we struggle with that today, even among Christians, the way that Christians should rule. Should they take over the government? Should they enforce their rules and regulations on the, or should they do like Jesus and do it by service to the point of being willing to die for others? I'm doing a
So
lot of talking, but anyway, go ahead, please.
this last part of the reading that we did, where Jesus is predicting, or he's warning his disciples that he's going to be arrested, you think that he's warned them several times. You'd think that they would not have been so shocked when it happened. And they would have been more more overprotective of him and not allowing him to put himself into positions where it was vulnerable for them, like going off and praying all by himself. You'd think that they would say, no, you can't do that. We need to protect you from being vulnerable. So it kind of surprises me that it's kind of like going over their head that he's saying this is going to happen, and they're like, oh no, that couldn't be.
Yeah, I think you're right, Carol. That's a good point. I think we hear what we want to sometimes, though. It's based on what we want to believe. And I think they weren't clearly understanding entirely what Jesus was all about and what his intention was. They still were very much wrapped up in their understanding of what they thought he should do and he would do. And so it's like a lot of us, sometimes we just don't get it the first time or the second time or the third time. We get what we want to get. And
Right.
that's it.
Well, and going back to the reading that we did at the beginning, where he says that Elijah's already come and they've treated him badly, I keep thinking that if and when Jesus does come, however he comes, I don't think that most people would say, oh yeah, there's Jesus. Here he is. He's here again. They'll just say, oh, I don't believe you. People are not, I don't think that if Jesus, when he comes, nobody's going to recognize him. So I think he's predicting his own fate here for when he comes back, that people are going to not realize who he is.
Well, you have to understand, I think, that when you talk about the ancient world, when you talk about dying on a cross like Jesus did, the idea that the Messiah could die on a cross, it's just unthinkable. Even in Paul, it talks about that. It's foolishness. They can't understand that a Messiah would die or be willing to die. Their whole concept was that he was going to take control and he was going to take over. The idea that he would be willing to die, that's where his love, his service to mankind would, that idea, that kind of a Messiah was just unheard of in the whole culture.
Well, don't you think it's still the same idea that if he came back today, people would still think, oh, he wouldn't be willing to do this all over again. They're like you said, they're expecting him to come riding in on a flaming white horse, and that's probably not the way it's going to happen. Well,
they even have trouble. Some people have trouble looking at Christianity as the kind of religion that you submit and you're willing to sacrifice yourself for the good of others. They think that Christians should be in charge. They should take charge and tell everybody else how to live.
And to everything, yeah.
I think I think in this next section too, we're talking about the temple tax, and the temple tax was a tax that every adult male was supposed to pay. And then it's interesting that even after the Romans took over, when they destroyed the temple, in order to punish the Jews further, they kept the temple tax in place and doubled it. So, yeah. And that was paid to Rome instead. This temple tax was paid to the temple to help maintain the temple, maybe to give some to the less fortunate, but to pay for the sacrifices and just the maintenance of the temple. And so it's interesting they're trying to trap him and say, aren't you supposed to pay the temple tax? And Jesus, of course, puts it on a whole different footing,
Mhm.
comes up with a way of coming up with the money for the temple tax, which is an interesting insight into the fact that they weren't exactly flush with money, apparently, because they didn't even have enough for the temple tax, which was just a drachma, which is not a large amount at all. So that's interesting. Okay, anything else for this last part of this chapter? Let's see, why don't we go ahead to chapter 18 then? And would someone be willing to read, I don't know, let's say wow, there's just a lot of things right on top of one another. Why don't we read through verse 14? Would someone be willing to do that for us?
Oh, I can read again, and this time I can read out of the Message.
Sure,
So
that'd be great.
chapter 18 through verse 14, you said?
Well, go ahead through verse 20, let's say, because that's one section.
Okay. All right, so "Whoever becomes simple again" is the title of this chapter. At about the same time, the disciples came to Jesus asking, "Who gets the highest rank in God's heaven, in God's kingdom?" For an answer, Jesus called over a child, whom he stood in the middle of the room and said, "I'm telling you once and for all, that unless you return to square one and start over like children, you're not even going to get a look at the kingdom, let alone get in. Whoever becomes simple and elemental again, like this child, will rank high in God's kingdom. What's more, when you receive the childlike on my account, it's the same as receiving me. But if you give them a hard time, bullying and taking advantage of their simple trust, you'll soon wish you hadn't. You'd be better off dropped in the middle of the lake with a millstone around your neck, doomed to the world for giving these God-believing children a hard time. Hard times are inevitable, but you don't have to make it worse, and it's doomsday to you if you do. If your hand or your foot gets in the way of God, chop it off and throw it away. You're better off maimed or lame and alive than the proud owners of 2 hands and 2 feet, godless in a furnace of eternal fire. And if your eye distracts you from God, pull it out and throw it away. You're better off one-eyed and alive than exercising your 20/20 vision from inside the fire of hell. Watch that you don't treat a single one of these childlike believers arrogantly. You realize, don't you, that their personal angels are constantly in touch with my Father in heaven. Look at it this way. If someone has 100 sheep and one of them wanders off, doesn't he leave the 99 and go after the one? And if he finds it, doesn't he make far more over it than over the 99 who stayed put? Your Father in heaven feels the same way. He doesn't want to lose even one of these simple believers. If a fellow believer hurts you, go and tell him. Work it out between the 2 of you. If he listens, you've made a friend. If he won't listen, take 1 or 2 others along so that the presence of witnesses will keep things honest, and try again. If he still won't listen, tell the church. If he won't listen to the church, you'll have to start over from scratch, confront him with the need for repentance, and offer again God's forgiving love. Take this most seriously. A yes on earth is a yes in heaven. A no on earth is no in heaven. What you say to one another is eternal. I mean this. when two of you get together on anything at all on earth and make it a prayer of it, my Father in heaven goes into action. And when 2 or 3 of you are together because of me, you can be sure that I'll be there.
Thanks, Carol. I think the first verse of 18 gives us some context about what we were talking about earlier, Carol, about, having to tell them over and over again. It's obvious from this first verse that they still haven't got the message. They're saying, okay, who gets the highest rank? Where am I going to be? The concern is about who's going to be on top. And they still haven't quite got the idea that what Jesus is trying to tell them is, well, the way you are on top isn't to be on top, but it's through service to others and building them up. And he uses children as an example of that. He says, children don't assume, well, most of them, if they're brought up right, don't assume that they're in charge. They don't assume that, I think he's using children as an example of humility here. But what are the rest of your observations about what you read through here? What sticks out?
Well, I think kids are more simple. They're more believing, they don't start the what ifs, what if this or what if that. They'll just, they're more willing to take things at face value and, follow suggestions.
I think kids are more black and white.
That's true too. Yeah.
There's no gray area, for children.
Right.
That's true. And in this culture, even more so than women, children have no power at all. They're under the authority of their parents. This is not a child-centered culture. The parents didn't ask their kids' opinion on everything, and dad didn't do everything he could to please the child. No, it was a brutal culture in a sense, because a lot of children didn't live to adulthood, but children were, they had the potential to be heirs, but as far as for power or the ability to control or to try to run things, no, not at all. They were humble, they were oppressed, and I think one of the main things he's trying to get to is here, I don't want you proud and trying to seek and seeing who's going to be highest. The way you need to live is not by determining who's in charge here, but you need to live lives of service and humility. And they're using children as an example of what it was to be in the kingdom of God in that culture was a pretty strong statement. And then they go on and talks about how important it is to go after people that stray and so forth and so on. Anything else that you guys saw in this passage that really stands out to you?
Well, one of the things that it talks about making amends with people that particularly agree with or get along with, and it's like he's saying, don't ever give up. Do whatever you can to make amends, whether you agree with them or not.
Yep. And in the context of church discipline, that's what he says. He puts it in that context. Go ahead, please.
Isn't that making amends part of the 12-step Alcohol Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous program?
Yes.
Mm.
Yes. I think the making of amends is, of course, for the person that you did wrong to let them know, but I think it's as much for the person who did the wrong. Making amends, it changes you. It gives you a different perspective. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of like too, where you see shows about people whose like their wife was killed or their child was killed, and they in court, they'll say, I forgive you to the person
Yes.
that did it. And people are like, I could never do that. How could they do that? You know, this was a horrific thing. How could they do that? But this is kind of what Jesus, I think, is saying here, that, you know, you have to find it in your heart, no matter what, that, you know, to be right with yourself, you have to be, you know, right with everybody else. And the part where he's talking about maiming yourself, I'm not sure he's meaning that literally. I don't think he would be meaning that literally, but he's just saying, be aware that there's a lot of things out there that are going to tempt you, and, you know, be aware, just try and cut that out of your life, that, you know, you don't want to allow yourself to put yourself in a position where you're going to be tempted to do something that's wrong.
Exactly. There's a lot of hyperbole in the New Testament, and even in the things that the saints of Jesus, they're difficult because, you know, this can be taken to an extreme. Sometimes it has been in a church. There have been people that have known to maim themselves. In fact, there are some well-known priests in the early church that emasculated themselves because they, you know, to protect themselves from temptation. So it certainly can be taken too far. But I think he's trying to point out that these are important issues, and we need to understand that we need to do everything we can to resist temptation, and not just give ourselves an excuse like, oh, you know, that's the way I am, like I can't do anything about it, or blame the person that tempts you. For example, that happens a lot in our culture, blaming women for tempting men, you know, saying, oh, it's the way she acts, the way she dresses, you know, you got your women, and blaming them for when the Bible clearly teaches that it's a person's responsibility to take, you know, for what they do themselves. So yeah. Okay. Anything else here we wanted to? Why don't we just close out real quickly? Why don't we read the last few verses in the story about forgiveness here? Because it gives us a good framework for this whole. I'm going to read to you real quick from the NRSV, I guess, and I'm going to start with verse 21. Then Peter came and said to him, Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? And Jesus said to him, not 7 times, but I tell you, 77 times, or 7 times 7. Well, anyway, a lot of times. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began to reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. And as he could not pay, his Lord ordered him to be sold, together with his wife and children, all his possessions, and payment to be made. So the slave fell on his knees before him, saying, have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the Lord of that slave released him and forgave him the debt. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii. And seizing him by the throat, he said, pay what you owe. Then his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, have patience with me, I will pay you. But he refused. Then he went and threw him into prison until he would pay the debt. When his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were just greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their Lord of all that had taken place. Then his Lord summoned him and said to him, you wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have mercy on your fellow slave as I had mercy on you? And in anger, his Lord handed him over to be tortured until he would pay his entire debt. So my heavenly Father would also do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart.
I have a hard time with this sometimes, thinking about how a person gets thrown in prison or tortured or whatever till they pay their debt. Well, they can't pay their debt if they're being tortured or if they're in prison, because they're not making any money.
Yep.
This just doesn't make sense to me. It's like, you can't pay your debt. There's no way. So it's just like in our society, we go to prison for things, and they said, well, you have to pay this much money. And how do you pay it if you're going to be sitting in jail?
Maybe he's referring to a mental jail, like, you know, you put yourself into a mental jail where people aren't willing to work at seeking forgiveness or seeking retribution to what they owe. So, you know, you can't get out of.
I think. Good
Go
point. I think when we talk about Jesus parables, sometimes we make the mistake of trying to make every specific detail fit. When it's not the details that it's about the overall lesson. And I think one thing it's important to realize is this parable is actually, it's a joke. People would laugh when they heard it because he talks about a man who owes, what did he say? He owes him this amount. I'm trying to get anyway. Anyway, that's this amount that he talks about that he owed him 10,000 talents. That was a joke. That's so much money. That's like saying Israel's debt to Rome, the whole tribute they had to pay to Rome for 3 years. It's a huge amount. It's just unbelievably, it's just an exaggerated amount. When people heard that any one man could owe the king that much, they would just laugh. And then on the other hand, the guy that owed this slave, it says it was 100 denarii, which is about 3 months' wages. So it's ridiculous, the comparison that the king forgave him so much and he was unwilling to forgive so little. And I think Jesus is just trying to say, you know, you all have a huge debt to God. And to not be willing to forgive those around you is just makes no sense. It's silly. You know, it just makes no sense at all. If God is that gracious to you, God also wants you to be that gracious to others. Anything else here? Nope.
No,
Well, all hearts and minds are clear. I guess this is a good place to just kind of wrap it up for this week. And we didn't hit everything. We just kind of bounced off of the high spots here,
yeah.
but really good high spots here to keep in mind.
Yeah.
The fact of what true greatness in the kingdom is, and that as we are forgiven, we should forgive others. All these things, those are really good things for us as Christians to remember in our world. These are things that we still struggle with, things that this world still needs to pay attention to. And these chapters in Matthew really give us a good understanding of what Jesus wants his followers to be like. So, yeah. So I hope you all have a good week.
Thank
No, I
you,
don't
Dave.
think we're gonna have Bible study next week. Is that correct? Because of Vacation Bible School? And
Yeah,
Jared,
That's
yeah,
fine.
yeah, so we probably will be not back for 2 weeks.
Right.
Yeah.
We'll see you all in 2 weeks or at church or whatever. Hope you
Yeah.
all have a good week. Take care.
Thank
And
you.
Take
thank you all for being here. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye,
Have a
everybody.
blessed week.
All right, thank you, David. This was great.
Thank you for participating.
Oh, well, I enjoy it. Okay, see you Sunday.